Hi everyone, Ken Ham here, CEO of Ancestors and Genesis Creation Museum in the Ark Encounter with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He's in our research department at Ancestors and Genesis and one of our speakers and a writer, author of the book Replacing Darwin. He's been doing an incredible amount of research on rewriting human history. Well, not rewriting biblical history, actually rewriting human history using research in genetics that shows very clearly a whole different approach to history that actually fits with what the Bible tells us, confirms the Bible's history. And we've been talking a lot about language groups going back to almost 70 basic groups. Oh, the Bible tells us in Genesis 10 about 70 basic groups there, 70 family groups that moved out from each other according to their languages that God gave at the Tower of Babel. But today, episode 16, Mysteries of the Ancient Pacific, the Aboriginal Australia, and early America. And I'm very interested in this, being one who comes from Australia. What happened in Australia before the Europeans arrived? Well, what is the story of the Australian Aboriginal people? And Dr. Jeanson, I'll be interested in what you got to say about this, because I know there are some legends in Australia. I heard about these when I was a teenager that say there were people there before the Australian Aboriginal people. But anyway, I'll be interested to see what you've got to say. What about pre-colonial history of the Pacific Islanders, Papua New Guinea? Who were the first people to arrive in the Americas? Could all of these regions be linked through an ancient genealogical heritage? Okay, so join Dr. Jeanson today as he helps us discover new clues to these dark eras of human history. Wow, this sounds like better than what you'd see on the Discovery Channel. So take it away for us today, Dr. Jeanson.
It's going to get crazy, so I hope our viewers will stick with us. Let's begin, though, by putting this in context before we get to the crazy stuff. We're discussing the larger question of who do we come from? History books often talk about what do we come from, what cultures and civilizations. This is the question of peoples and genealogy. What's the relationship among living people today and between the ancient cultures and civilizations and peoples of those civilizations and us? I used to think that they were far away and disconnected. Genetics has now brought them much closer than I ever expected. And we're beginning to move in the direction of ancient history. And today's episode tries to get at the earliest history, and most obscure history of what a couple regions of our planet. We've been focusing on the history of Native Americans, though we've seen some shocking things in previous episodes. Today's Native Americans were not the first Americans. They arrived from Central Asia in the AD era. We've looked at clues from history, from genetics, from archaeology, from linguistics to try to tell some of their story. We've seen some of that in previous episodes. We want to find out who was here first to try to round out this narrative and understand the history of the continent, which Ken and I now call home. So today's Native Americans are the result of this process around these dates. Yet from archaeology, we know that there was previous civilizations. The Olmec civilization existed in central Mexico, at the earliest BC times. They were followed by the Mayans, who began in the BC era, extended into the AD era. Episode 14, we talked about how the arrival of these new peoples may have been a causative factor in the disappearance of the Central Mayan Classic era civilization. But what is the origin of these peoples? Who do they come from? Why did they arrive here? What's their narrative? It's going to be very different from what we've all been taught. Discovery Channel, National Geographic, in school, these sorts of things. They didn't arrive 15,000 years ago. What is their story? Well, in episode 1, we've seen that the world is smaller than we think, and this point is being emphasized over and over again. This is based on human population history. Episode 2, we looked at just the math of human family trees, our ancestors, to reach the same conclusion. And it's a good way to start this series, because when we look at the Y chromosome tree, which is the major focus of what we're doing now, that the male inherited DNA, there's wild stuff, and it's going to get even wilder today. We've seen that ethnic change, so-called racial change, happens much quicker than we think. Episode 3, if we combine that with slight differences in reproductive rates, you can get some really crazy conclusions, theoretical possibilities. For example, most Caucasians being of recent African descent in theory, and you have to go to episode 4 to see how that works. The big bombshell as it relates to mainstream science was what we covered in episodes 5 and 6. What we see in these episodes, not just 5 and 6, but in all the ones that we're doing, is information you can't find elsewhere. The genetic information we're discussing is information you can't buy for $100 from Family Tree DNA, from 23andMe, Ancestry.com. They can't tell you this because, number one, their DNA tests look at DNA that's inherited from both parents, and so you can only go back 4 or 5 generations, which the research my dad has done independent of genetics is something we can reach. So you might be paying $100 for and not learn much more than you already know. It's male only inherited or female only inherited DNA that's the key. For technical reasons, it's the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, that is where the business of this really lies. And you can see episodes 5 and 6 for why that is. And the basic principle is the more DNA differences in the Y chromosome that exist between us, the more distant the relationship, the fewer the DNA differences, the closer the genealogical relationship. Well, this has some shocking implications for the history of Europe. There are lost relatives in India and Central Asia that we never would have expected. That's episode 7. We've seen the explanation, potential explanation for this is the Mongol Empire and the aftermath of it, episode 8. We've seen there's an ancient Chinese connection to modern Europe, episode 9, despite China being a historically isolated and insular society. There are connections thanks to the barbarians from the north that join Europe and China. We've looked at the history of Americans, those who came over after Columbus, and seen that there's a hidden history. The ancestors of most Americans are not who you think they are. They go back to Central Asia in the recent past, about 1000 AD and more recently. We've seen a revolution in pre-Columbian history. This is really the beginning of the section on what happened before Columbus. Even mainstream archaeology is dramatically rewriting this in a rapid way that's hard to keep up with. That's episode 11. 12, we looked at the genetic evidence for a resettling event before Columbus. This is what I've been referring to as the early AD era, migration from Central Asia. There's been a neglected history. There's an agreement between some of these Native American oral and written histories and this genetic discoveries, which should prompt us to go and relook at these tantalizing clues. There may be a whole lot more history than people have granted credit to the Native American tribes. We've looked at the synthesis between mainstream archaeology and these modern genetic discoveries to see some new explanations for population collapses, civilization collapses in the Americas before Columbus. Last episode, we looked at the ancient Native American connection to modern Europe. We can fill in some of the story of Native Americans in a way we never expected. And this has implications for how we understand relationships between Caucasians and Native Americans today, and implications for racism and such too. Today, we want to look at mysteries of the ancient Pacific and Australia and how they might relate to early America. Before the arrival of Columbus in the Americas, Europeans thought that the world consisted of 3 continents. And this map from 1490 shows you just that. Well, of course, Columbus famously, we would say, discovers the Americas. He didn't know that. He didn't know he was arriving in the Americas. He, of course, famously and infamously called the natives Indians because he thought he had made it to India, and that's what he's looking for, an alternative route to get to that spice trade. Well, it wasn't just the Americas to which he opened European eyes, North and South America, 2 new continents. He also brought the existence of a whole new ocean to the attention of Europeans, and a window to an entirely different and very dark as in mysterious chapter of human history, the history of the Pacific. This has long been a neglected part of human history. In episode 1, we talked about the history of human population growth and how it's been much more localized than I've been led to believe, because I think in terms of maps and political entities, well, if you look at where the people are, even in 1000 BC, there's only a few spots in the globe where there's heavy concentrations, which is why, and this finally answered a question for me, why history books tend to focus only on certain parts of the world. What's where the people are. Notice, though, that Pacific, Australia, Papua New Guinea, largely empty. There's some right here, but there aren't that many people there. Fast forward 1,000 years, it's still largely empty. The major loci of the world increase in their populations: India, China, Europe, Central America, but Sub-Saharan Africa, largely empty. 1000 AD, it's still largely empty. And we've seen evidence from archaeology that's rewriting how we think about population concentrations here. So some of this will have to be revised and will continue to be revised as we go forward in mainstream archaeology. But over here, the Australian Aborigines, Papua New Guinea, again, there isn't that much shaded here in the map, and it only becomes more shaded, and this seems to be largely due to the arrival of Europeans and such. My point here is it's been neglected and was neglected in the 1000 Genomes Project. This is one of the first studies we looked at. we observed that the populations this particular mainstream study sampled didn't cover much of the map. It covered much of where the people are, but notice that it neglects down here, Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, Australia. And the reason for that is because there just haven't been that many people there historically. Europeans had this brought to their attention early again, or excuse me, I should say late in history, because of the arrival of Columbus. The Spanish and the Portuguese were the first to do the exploring. We'll zoom in on this map momentarily. What I want you to see is that for the Spanish, the Philippines are a major locus and destination for their travels. We're going to zoom in here now and see some of these dates, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. This is when it finally enters the realm of European attention. However, for many of us, it doesn't enter European attention until one of the major land masses of the Pacific is discovered. That land mass is missing from this AD 1627 map. The southern continent was brought to European attention largely to the work of Captain James Cook. He was not the first European to arrive in Australia, but he's the one responsible for putting it on our map. And of course, when he arrives, he encounters people who look nothing like him, the Australian Aborigines. And it's not just Australia where Europeans encounter folks who look much different from them. It's Papua New Guinea. They look different. And of course, Polynesia, Micronesia have a much more Asian look. None of these people have European looks. And to look at more modern examples, again, these people today look nothing like Europeans. And if we didn't know any better, we might look at some of these Polynesians and wonder if they didn't have an East Asian connection because of the obvious physical similarities. Well, why would we talk about any of this if our larger question is the question of the origin of the first peoples of the Americas? Well, why would we talk about these sorts of peoples? Obviously, there's a physical connection between some of the Polynesians, and you can see obvious physical resemblances between Polynesians and today's Native Americans. But as we've discovered in this series, today's Native Americans are the product of a more recent migration. And they underwent a major population collapse. East Asia didn't undergo such a major population collapse where maybe 90% of the people died out. There was Black Death in Asia at some point, but China is still over 1 billion people strong. Among the natives, though, of the Pacific, there is evidence for population collapses there due to similar reasons. Europeans coming over, perhaps inadvertently bringing diseases to which the natives were not resistant. And so some of them died out as well. And this has the consequence of obscuring some of their history. So what is the history of the Pacific in Papua New Guinea and Australia before the arrival of Europeans? And might it reveal some connections to early America? Last episode, we looked at 3 major disciplines of science to look for clues to a different question: the history of those who arrived in the early AD era. Could we glean something from these same 3 fields? Well, if we're talking written history, that basically begins with the arrival of Europeans. There's very little at this point that this reveals, but as Ken mentioned, there's legend stories from these indigenous groups. We've seen in the Americas that there's some very intriguing parallels between these native accounts and what we're discovering in genetics. Could there be something also present in these accounts? This is worthy of a re-examination. But I'm going to leave that historical discipline alone for the moment, because at this point in time, I can't tell you much more of the research that illumines what happened. Let's turn to linguistics instead, because we'll find some clues that make this question and the answers to it more obvious. You might recall from the previous episode that there's, at first pass, a little bit of a discrepancy that seems to appear, if you look at the number of language groups listed in Genesis 10 and the number of languages today. So we would say as creationists that there was one original language after the flood. Genesis 11 describes why God broke up these people groups, early people groups, into different language groups. It was because they rebelled against his command to spread out. So he confused their languages. And Genesis 10 gives us the basic family groupings. Yet it's 100 times smaller than the number of languages today. Well, we saw that if you look at languages today, there's some very intriguing similarities, differences and similarities among them. German and English bear some obvious linguistic similarities. Spanish and Latin bear some similarities. It almost begs people to classify them and implies some sort of historical relationships. We saw that the language category of family seems to be a good first approximation for what these original languages were. In other words, you can take the language today, look at their similarities and differences, and group them to successively smaller and more inclusive groupings. And family is a academic category that exists in modern linguists, and there are only twice as many language families as the number of families, literal families, listed in Genesis 10. And we've seen that a good chunk of this, about half of these language families exist only in the Americas. And we looked at reasons for why that might be reduced in the future. Even mainstream linguists are talking about how all the languages in the Americas might eventually be grouped in a single language family. We just haven't done the deep dive analysis of this yet to reach that conclusion. There's been one academic, Greenberg, who's done this, but mainstream folks say the analysis wasn't rigorous enough yet, though they seem to be sympathetic towards the conclusion he's trying to reach. Well, what can linguistics tell us about the history of the Pacific and of Aboriginal Australia and such? Again, just to review the basic principle, notice Africa, as a good simple example, has just a handful of language families. In orange, the Afro-Asiatic family. This includes Arabic and such. You might, if you know your history of the Muslim conquest, say, well, that sounds a lot like Muhammad's conquests and those of his Muslim descendants. Yes, and so that tells you languages hold within them clues to history. They echo human history. Niger-Congo is a major language family in Africa that covers much of Central and West Africa. You have the Click languages, the Khoisan. We'll talk about some of this in the future. These are sort of the rock stars of mainstream genetics. They talk about, here's the cradle of mankind and 200,000 years ago. Well, we'll talk about that in the future. Notice though, Madagascar, the African island, doesn't have linguistic connections to mainland Africa. It shares a color over here in Southeast Asia. So let's zoom in on that because it now takes us to the Pacific. There are language connections. There is a single language family, Austronesian, that connects Madagascar, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and many of these Pacific islands. And there's subgroupings within it that scientists, or I should say linguists, have come up with. Here we've moved Madagascar artificially close so we can see this group. There's a subgrouping here that joins Madagascar, Indonesia, the Philippines. There's subgroupings that join the Pacific Islands, subgroupings here and here. Notice that they skirt Papua New Guinea, avoid Australia. And these linguistic groupings roughly fit the major divisions we looked at earlier. Micronesia, Polynesia are joined linguistically, but they're separate from Melanesia by and large, Papua New Guinea and Australia. And they tend to roughly fit these physical different groupings. Polynesians obviously have a look like this. This is a Maori girl from New Zealand, and she has a more Asian look. The Melanesians, like the Papua New Guineans, the Aboriginal Australians, have a much more, I'd say, an African look with darker skin and very tight curly hair. These sort of language groupings and linguistic data have been combined with archaeology by mainstream scientists to come up with a model for the settling of the Pacific. It's a very intriguing one. Now, just as a general rule of thumb, and we'll talk about this more in future episodes, when we talk about archaeological dates, pre-1000 BC dates, we're going to see eventually get corrected. After 1000 BC, there tends to be agreement between mainstream archaeology and what Scripture says. For example, mainstream archaeologists acknowledge the existence of King David around 1000 BC. There's still differences. I'm not saying there's a perfect identity, but generally from 1000 BC forward, you can probably trust the dates that they give. Before that, there's other factors, worldview factors that affect it. So I want to draw our attention first to these red and purple arrows. We'll talk about the blue momentarily. Due to linguistic and archaeological data, linguistically, mainstream folks would say the Austronesian languages began in Taiwan, spread down through the Philippines, and then skirted the coasts of Papua New Guinea, eventually spreading to these islands out here. You can look at the first archaeological evidence for human settlement. And so, in short, if we were to think of this and correct some of these dates mentally, there is an early origin of the Austronesian languages in Taiwan, they'd say. They come down here early in the BC era. Again, the specific dates we'll talk about more in future episodes. They've reached Samoa, early BC era. This is again nearly 1,000 years before Christ. But then it stops. And the distant Pacific Islands, even in mainstream science, they would say, are not settled until very late in history, shortly before Europeans arrive. Hawaii isn't settled until about 8,900. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, those large statues, they aren't settled until 8,900. New Zealand, the Maoris, not until 8,1200. This was a shock to me. I didn't think that these islands would have such a late history and would have been empty for so long, but this is the mainstream scientific view. What I want to point out here is that this migration, there's an initial migration and then a subsequent migration. The subsequent migration, going to the distant far reaches of the Pacific, doesn't happen until late in history. And it post-dates what I've argued from genetics was the resettling of the Americas. So if we're thinking about potential connections between Pacific and the Americas, even what I'm saying, this shock of a resettling, predates what mainstream scientists would say is the eventual settling of the Pacific. So my impression is that this stage here, what's in this triangle, probably is not relevant to our understanding of the history of the Americas. And of course, the bigger question we're trying to get at is what are the earliest settlers of the Americas? But that's not the only thing I want us to notice in this diagram. There are blue arrows here pointing towards Papua New Guinea and go down here into Australia. You don't have dates on them. And mainstream science, the dates for the settling of Australia go back 60,000 years, they would say. And Papua New Guinea, maybe 20,000 years. My point is there's a very distant ancient history in mainstream scientists, in mainstream science for the settling of these islands. We're going to correct these dates in the future. I want you to see that in the relative sense, they say Australia, Papua New Guinea settled first, and the Austronesian language expansion happens later. That's the point. The Polynesians, they would say, are later arrivals to the Pacific. These groups are some of the earliest. So that's just from looking at these Austronesian languages. Now I want us to notice from a linguistics perspective, Papua New Guinea and Australia. Now today you'll notice this light green color, which we also find here in South Africa, Europe, the Americas. That's the Indo-European family because there's so many European settlers speaking English. That's why you see this dominant green color here. Of course, that's why you see green in the US. English is the main language, and green down here because Spanish and Portuguese, also Indo-European languages, the dominant ones there. However, there's a salmon color in Australia, and there's multiple colors up here in Papua New Guinea. The Papuan languages, so they're not Austronesian languages, are different. And in fact, it's a mistake to color this just one red color in terms of language families. There's a whole bunch of language families in Papua New Guinea. So Europe has basically one dominant language family. There's a Finno-Ugric language family that ties Hungarian and Finnish and such, and some in modern day Russia, minority language groups. The island of New Guinea alone has not just a bunch of languages, a bunch of language families. There's a ton of linguistic evidence here. And what I want us to see is that the linguistic evidence, separate language families in Australia and a whole bunch in Papua New Guinea, fit this relative timing of the settling. It seems to indicate that the Australian Aborigines and the speakers of all these language families in New Guinea arrived here first. There's a synthesis, a relative synthesis. There's deep linguistic origins for Papua New Guinea and for Australia, and archaeologically they'd say they were some of the earliest arrivals here. So there's some other points of agreement I want us to see. Linguistically and combined with archaeologically, it looks like whoever arrived in Australia and Papua New Guinea arrived first. We'll talk about the question of whether there was a resettling momentarily. But just based on linguistics, there's a bunch of different deep language families in New Guinea. There's a deep linguistic origin for Australia, and this seems to fit this relative Papua New Guineans, Melanesians first, and then the Austronesians and Polynesians later. What about genetics, though? This is where it gets very interesting and may illumine potential connections to the early Americas. Let's begin with this study. Notice that they don't sample any groups in the Pacific, again, because they're where the people are, and historically, again, this has been neglected because there haven't been that many people in the Pacific. So instead, we're going to turn to this study, which does sample. So this particular study tried to get as broad an ethnic sampling of the globe, but perhaps a shallow look. There's more Southeast Asian groups, there's Filipino groups, there's New Guinea groups. We'll talk about this as well as some of the other groups from other studies. We're just going to begin here though. And what I want us to look at first, notice I've colored groups from Oceania in dark purple. We want to find spots on this tree where the dark purple peoples are. And there's two spots. If you're able to look close, you might not see it based on the level of zooming I have here. There's a group up here, and there's a group down here. I'm going to begin with the upper ones. And you might recall from previous episodes that we've been assigning letters and names and such, which seems somewhat arbitrary to these various groups. But there is a method to this madness. Mainstream scientists have a system to doing it. We've talked about how the very deep branches in the tree get assigned, first of all, a letter of the alphabet, an uppercase letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, so forth. Then, if these very deep branches break up into subgroups, you assign a number. So there, we've talked about the group R and group R1, R2. And then if that gets broken up even further, it's R1A, R1B. So it's letters, numbers, and so forth. That's the system that they have for assigning it. And what we see here is that there's so many deep groupings in the Pacific, they're assigned separate letters. There's S, there's K, there's M. In Europe, we talk about R1B, a very specific subgrouping being dominant in Western Europe. In the Pacific alone, in Papua New Guinea, you have multiple deep branchings, and they're assigned these separate letters.
Dr. Jeanson, just to clarify here for those that may not have seen some of the previous episodes, this is all based on research conducted on differences and similarities in the Y chromosome inherited through the male, correct?
Exactly. This is Y chromosome based, and this tree is reconstructed based on how many differences and similarities. So when I say there's a deep branching, it means there are huge differences in the Y chromosome, the male inherited DNA, between, if we can zoom in here momentarily just to see who these people are, the Kosipi, the dark purple, are the Papua New Guineans. The Agta are people from the Philippines. The Aeta from the Philippines. Lebo and Baho are also close by, just to put them on the map here, in Indonesia. So even though they're geographically close, they have tremendous genetic differences among them. There's a huge number of Y chromosome differences, even though they're geographically very close. Physically, the Papua New Guineans, of course, have this, what I'm going to say is a sort of an African look, with dark skin, African-like features and hair and nose and lips and such. Indonesians, many of them have a more of a Asian look. Well, the Filipinos do as well, yet the specific Filipino peoples that we looked at are called Negrito groups because they have an African appearance to them. They're a small minority in the Philippines, but there are dark-skinned, curly-haired people in the Philippines. That's who these Agta and Aeta peoples are, and they're right next to on the tree, these Indonesians. And when I say next to, it's a very deep next to. They're next to geographically, yet they don't have these common ancestors until pre-1000 BC, which is remarkable. So geographically close, they're neighbors, yet genetically on this Y chromosome tree, the differences are enormous and indicate a very deep ancient history, which again seems to fit what we've been discussing linguistically and archaeologically. The settlement of the Pacific, the Polynesian settlement, happens late in history. The Melanesian settlement, and notice that these arrows pass through Indonesia, happens very early. So that's where we're at so far. Now, it raises some questions. Why do we have lighter-skinned, Asian-looking peoples as part of this ancient mix? I thought linguistically Indonesia was tied to Madagascar over here and some of the Pacific Islands and Polynesians. Why would they have this deep heritage? Well, if you look at some of the peoples of Indonesia, you might notice that they seem to have what could be perhaps African-looking Papua New Guinea type features. This is one particular tribe in Indonesia. These three gentlemen are all part of the same tribe. Yet if you look carefully at their faces, there's some significant differences. There's diversity even within this single Indonesian tribe. Look at his eyes. Look how East Asian they appear. Yet look at the noses and the lips of these gentlemen. Are those African in origin? I'm going to show you two slides now in which I keep the lady on the left, who's Chinese, and the gentleman on the right, who's Papua New Guinean, the same. But the middle person is going to be an Indonesian in each case, but a different Indonesian. There are some Indonesians who bear obvious resemblance to East Asia. Not identical. Obviously, his nose, his lips are different from this lady's facial structure, but his eyes, his skin tone look East Asian. Yet there are other Indonesians who, if we didn't know any better, look like they're a mix of perhaps Asian features and yet have strong resemblances, nose, lips, and such, perhaps skin tone, to the Papua New Guineans. Well, that's not accidental, I don't think. We've looked so far at one of the genetic branches that show up in Papua New Guinea. Now I want to look at another one that might give us some hints as to why these physical similarities and differences exist in people groups that are geographically very close. So let's move our attention now down to here. Purple shows up down here, this deep purple that I'm labeling Oceania. This is part of a larger group that we call Group C. So again, it's a different letter because it's got a deep connection. Group C has a diversity of peoples on it. Let's zoom in first and see who they are, and then look at their connections and see what this means historically. Notice that again, this royal blue indicates East Asian, Southeast Asian. You might not recognize these names. Marut is Indonesian. Aeta, again, are these Negrito, African-looking peoples in the Philippines. Lebo is Indonesian. What's this? This is light green. This is South Asian, India and such. There's an Indian person that shows up in this lineage. And in fact, there is a whole group of South Asians that have a deep connection in this Group C. Dusun and Baho are again Indonesians. Here's the purple, the Papua New Guineans. And if we go down here on these branches, pink is Siberia. There's a whole bunch of Siberian groups. Light green is Central Asian. So you might not recognize these names, just recognize that they're pink, they're Siberian. Kazakhs, you might recognize that name, Central Asian. There's this big Siberian branch that's part of the tree. Now, the date, and again, you can see here there's a big deep blue branch, a deep green branch, blue. The Papua New Guineans show up here again. If we brought in data from other studies, you can see there would be deep Australian Aborigine branches here. There's a deep Siberian branch. This splitting up happens around 800 BC. Now again, depending on where you put Noah, that date changes some. The point is it happens after the dates we saw in this other branching. It seems to be a second diversification event, which may have some echo in what Ken referred to in the Australian Aboriginal legends. There were people here before. Well, what does this mean? How can we understand these deep branching events? So again, notice what's happening here. Around 800 BC, or sometime in the distant past, there's a South Asian lineage that emerges. There's a Southeastern Asian lineage, Indonesian lineages that emerge. If we had more other groups that we brought in here, there'd be Australian Aboriginal and Papua New Guinean lineages that emerge. There's a Siberian lineage that emerges. So let's put these on the map, combining this study along with others. Around 800 BC, after the settling of Papua New Guinea and Australian Aborigines, there's a diversification event where you have an ancient lineage that shows up in Siberia and Central Asia. If we brought in other data, you'd see a Japanese lineage. You'd see, again, Southeast Asian, Papua New Guinean, Aborigine. There's South Asian. So it appears to be a migration event where these groups spread out, and these lineages appear then to be restricted. After they split, there's a lineage that seems to be restricted to Japan, restricted to Siberia and Central Asia, restricted to India, restricted. They spread out and then take up their roots, spread out, and then plant new roots elsewhere in these locations. So what in the world is going on here? Who's the one who's spreading out? Where do these people come from? And why do they end up in these locations? Looking at how the geography is spread out here, does it mean that there's a Filipino group, Indonesian group that's spreading out in all directions? Do you take the bullseye center and attribute it that way so that there's a second grouping that then moves into Australia and Papua New Guinea? I want to take a deeper look at this. Again, this study doesn't sample any groups in the Pacific, but it does have people who are in Group C. I'm bringing up this study because it also has people in Group D. which are close by. In this particular study, group D has a very strong echo, and in the study, the only echo in Japan. I think it's about a third of Japan. And when I had this study in hand, I thought, oh, this just must be an ancient Japanese lineage. Well, lo and behold, if you look more broadly in the globe, and especially at some of these neglected minority groups, there is a group of people in the Andaman Islands. You've probably never heard of these before, unless you studied South Asian history. They belong, I think, to India. The great Andamanese peoples do not look like Indians, like South Asians. They look like Africans. They're very dark-skinned, dark-haired, curly-haired. They look like African peoples, and they show up, so they're nearly extinct. The males that we've been able to sample show up in group D. They share a common ancestor with the Japanese people, and they share a common ancestor around the same time that we saw this migration event in group C. So what in the world is going on here? Let's add this to the map. I'm going to color them purple because they have this obvious physical resemblance to peoples right here. So you have, in ancient times, something that's probably never been documented in history, but from genetics, we have an event for some dispersal of peoples, not the Babel dispersal. This is after that. This is at least 1,000 years after that, and at least 1,000 years after the initial settling of Papua New Guinea and Australia. So what in the world is going on here? In this study, the group C peoples show up down here. C and D show up down here. Sub-Saharan African peoples show up right here. And Sub-Saharan African peoples show up only there. If we go to this study, again, I mentioned you can find, even though you don't have the Papua New Guineans and such, you do have peoples that are part of groups C and D, and you have a much better sampling of Africa. So groups C and D show up there. Sub-Saharan Africa shows up there and only there. And from my perspective, if you look at the distribution of Sub-Saharan Africans in these lineages, I still have a zoomed out scenario, but I'm doing this because I want you to see that C and D are almost swallowed up in Sub-Saharan Africa. You could make the case that they look like they're African descendants. Again, the original Papua New Guineans show up in S, K, and M up here. So I would argue that genetically there's definitely evidence for an initial very early settling of Papua New Guinea and Australian Aborigines. But could there be a second settling? Again, we've looked at in group C a distribution. It seems to be in 800 AD, C and D, there's something that happens where people spread out all across South, East, North Asia, as well into the Pacific. So what's going on? Is this an Indonesian group that spreads out? Could this be dark-skinned peoples, African peoples, who moved into Africa and then decided to move back out of Africa and keep going? Let's think about the population history when we think about these ethnic or so-called racial components. Remember again, the Pacific, Australian Aborigines, historically, at least in a traditional sense, have been viewed as people poor. They've always been a very small part of the global world population. And if you think about what we discussed in episodes 3 and 4, where ethnic change can happen faster than we think about about the math of reproductive growth, these dark-skinned peoples have historically been very few in number. So let's think about it. One hypothesis. Is this ancient migration event, 800 BC, they're spreading out? Could it be a dark-skinned peoples? Well, if it was a migration of dark-skinned peoples from the Pacific, a region of the globe where they've always been few in number, what we're talking about most likely then would be a migration of a small number of people into South Asia, East Asia, Siberia, Japan, where they're probably the minority population. And based on the genetics that we discussed in episodes 3 and 4, their descendants would probably not look dark-skinned and dark-haired. They'd blend into the dominant population. Yet they could end up leaving, genetically, descendants in which their heritage is obviously coming from the Pacific. My point is, if this is a migration of dark-skinned peoples in 800 BC, and I'm suspicious that it is, you would not see dark-skinned peoples in these other regions of the globe because simple math. However, you could still see this heritage being dark-skinned. Here's another geographic clue I want to bring into the equation. Again, dark-skinned peoples, and I've been using the term African, dark-skinned peoples show up heavily in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, how interesting is that? Each of these peoples, here, and I'm talking about the Negrito, the Aeta, the Agta peoples who look like Africans, and here, all of these dark-skinned, dark-haired peoples, and also over here, not only do they share some morphological similarities, they all have ancient lineages. I mentioned that this S and K and M lineages exist in Papua New Guinea, and my guess is actually that, so here you've got dark-skinned peoples, the Aeta and Agta here. This is dark-skinned, this is dark-skinned, this is dark-skinned. I'm suspicious that these Indonesians, even though they may look light-skinned, are probably the result of intermixing. I mean, they're right next to Papua New Guinea. So my guess is these are probably light-skinned, but originally Papua New Guinean peoples. They have a very ancient lineage. The Andamanese peoples are part of this ancient migration event. You can ask the question, are these originally dark-skinned peoples who make their way into Japan, or originally Japanese Asian peoples who make their way into the Great Andaman Islands? I'm suspicious that it's the former, that it's dark-skinned peoples who eventually make their way into Japan, so that some Japanese peoples actually have dark-skinned heritage. Same thing then for India and Indonesia and Siberia. My suspicion is these are dark-skinned peoples originally. This is an ancient dark-skinned lineage that spreads out, and then today, because of just the math and the genetics that we discussed, look Asian or Indian or these so forth. Again, they're swallowed up in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll talk about in future episodes how Africa also has a very ancient genetic lineage. How intriguing that these regions of the globe, the Andaman Islands, some of the Filipinos, again, the dark-skinned ones, New Guinea, Australia, sub-Saharan Africa, all of these have a certain morphological tie-in, physical similarity, and they have an ancient genetic heritage. And also, they exist at a similar latitude. So here is a narrative hypothesis that seems to be emerging. Could all of these connections, genetically and physical, be due to a lot of early migration activity? Whatever the exact explanation is, we know, first of all, that there's ancient lineages in these spots, and there is a lot of ancient migration activity. Regardless of what the actual origin of this activity is, there's a lot of movement going on in the ancient past, more than we ever thought. Could it be that there were, after Babel, some people moving down into Africa, some people moving here, and maybe after Babel, some people continuing to move this direction? Well, what's to stop them from continuing to move eastward? If there were people that went this way, and then went this way, and we know there's a lot of migration happening, what's to stop these dark-skinned peoples from continuing their migrations in the eastward direction? Well, if they did that, that would bring them to the shores of the Americas. The earliest peoples are the Olmecs that we find archaeological evidence for, not necessarily a household name, but their carvings are something our viewers might be familiar with. How intriguing that the physical features on these carvings, look at the shape of the nose, the eyes, the lips, seem to find an echo in modern day Indonesia. And I've argued that some of these Indonesians look like they're the product of mixing between Asian groups and Papua New Guineans, and the Papua New Guineans being some of the earliest. After the Olmecs come the Mayans. They have a BC era origin archaeologically, a late BC, shortly before the time of Christ, and they of course continue into the AD era. Based on their carvings, to me they look like they have more of the Asian look. You can see it better here in this particular carving. And I'm bringing up the carvings because we have to remember, and we have to get out of our minds, the image we have of today's Native Americans, because the physical features these people possess are the product of a later migration event. They're going to echo their Asian origin, and they're mixing, perhaps, with the peoples who were here first. So whatever features they have are not necessarily the features that the earliest Americans have. That's why I'm emphasizing these carvings. Who did these people come from? Could it be that the builders of these monuments came from peoples like this? Could these be how the first Americans looked? It's a very intriguing hypothesis, and we'll talk about in future episodes some genetic tools we could use to explore it. At the moment, nobody knows whether or not this is true. There's some very intriguing physical, linguistic, genetic clues that are suggesting this direction. Nobody has the genetics yet of the earliest Americans, but these together suggest a very intriguing connection between these ancient dark eras of human history. And again, we'll talk about in future episodes ways in the future we might be able to find out. And obviously, I have a great interest in this, and we'll talk about steps I've been taking the last several months to try to answer this. Research that's still happening, and what I want to emphasize here again is this is a new era of creation science research. This isn't just anti-evolutionary research. We've made so much progress, we can now begin to try to address, explore, and answer questions that mainstream science has not had access to. This is creation science making positive new steps for the future, taking the lead in academic research and illuminating aspects of our history that no one's been able to illuminate before.
Well, I can tell, Nathaniel, you get very excited about all this, of course, and you're enjoying this. I guess this is one of the positives, if we can say that, of the COVID-19 situation, where you get locked in your house and you just research this stuff. And
Exactly.
then you're able to give the results to all of us. You know, I've said before, in one of the previous sessions, that when you come into the Creation Museum, one of the first big exhibits big exhibit area we call the starting points room, where we explain to people your starting point determines your worldview and how you interpret evidence. If people had have taken the Bible as their starting point, as their foundation for their worldview, and taken that as God's word, infallible, the history given there is infallible, and then started thinking about all that we see in regard to people groups and archaeology and now genetics research, we would know a lot more about human history. But you're making up for all of that in the research that you're doing. You're going to put it in a book. Hopefully sometime during 2021, we'll have that book and maybe do some more series discussing these topics. But we're going to continue on with this series. We're now at episode 16. So 17 and 18 will be the next two next week. Before I ask you a quick summary of those, people can go to our streaming service. You can get a 7-day free trial, and it's answers.tv, answers.tv. And we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items on there right now for kids, for adults, for teens. We have fun entertainment, music. Of course, we have a very high standard in all that we do in regard to those things. Our previous VBS songs for kids to help mums and dads entertain them, but teach them God's word. We have kids programs. We have science. We have Bible. We have Ray Comfort and quite a number of his videos on there. And a lot of our live programming, in fact, all of our live programming now goes to answers.tv, and we still have live programming on Facebook and YouTube, but it all now goes to answers.tv. So I encourage people to subscribe to answers.tv and go and watch all of the previous episodes. So quickly before we finish, what can we expect from episode 17 and 18 coming up?
And before I do, just one more quick foot stamping. I want to point out that I think what this episode shows is a refutation of a common stereotypical accusation against us. Well, you creationists, you're anti-science, you kill science, God did it, that settles it, and there's no more questions to ask. What we've just seen is actually, if you start with the Bible, which gives a tremendous framework in which to understand the world, it opens up a tremendous number of new research questions, an entirely new paradigm that makes progress. Starting with the scripture is very pro-science, not anti-science, and what we've just observed is itself a refutation of that sadly common accusation. Well, what we're going to discover, more research questions that we're going to explore. We're going to return to Europe in episode 17, looking at the question of what happened to the Vikings. Could you and I be descendants of these peoples? We've been looking at a lot of the Central Asian connections. Well, that's not the entire story. There's more to be explored in Europe. And if today's episode wasn't provocative enough, in episode 18, we're going to go to the question of, can the Jews be identified genetically? Can we find Moses and Aaron in the history in our world today? What about the relationship to the Arabs and the Muslims and the long history of fracas there? Of course, there's eschatological questions for Christians, different camps on the future of ethnic Israel or not. So if that wasn't explosive enough today, surely we'll light a powder keg in episode 18, and I hope our viewers will join us for that.
Okay, episode 18. I think we're going to get a lot of comments. That's going to be very interesting, that particular one. But we look forward to the next two episodes, 17 and 18. And how many more do you think there'll be? How many more weeks do you think we'll do? How much content do you have?
We'll probably do about 20 to 25. After that, we'll look at sub-Saharan Africa, ancient India. We still want to talk about the Neanderthals. We'll talk about some additional biblical insights that I've been prompted towards. We'll eventually summarize and basically retell history in short order. In light of all that we've discussed, what is the history of the globe? We'll do that in short, rapid-fire summary form. We'll deal with an episode on the question of evolutionary evidence. What about this claim about no Adam and Eve? And what do you do about these ancient dates? We'll have hopefully a very helpful episode on that. And end with, where do we go from here? How can we understand? I'm a viewer, and how can we personally say, who am I? What steps can we take? Is there can we start a company, Ancestry and Genesis? What do our viewers do if they want to understand their own heritage? Because again, this is stuff you can't find necessarily in commercial genetic testing. So that's where we eventually want to land. And I anticipate 20 to 25 episodes in total to reach that point.
Very good. Well, thanks, Dr. Jeanson. And again, you can go to answers.tv to see all of the programs, catch up on everything that Dr. Jeanson has related to us. We look forward to the next two programs next week.